Okay, everybody, we're going to get started. I'd love you to introduce you to my colleague, Ash Ryan. I like this title, Technical Evangelist, and maybe he'll go into what that means. He's going to give a really insightful talk. I think that'll come in pretty well with quite a few of what you've been learning lately, and talk a little bit more about his road to being a developer.
Thank you. Yeah, so thanks for having me. I'm really excited to give this talk. I actually gave a similar talk recently in Manhattan, and I got to meet William, who was similar. So big thanks to all the instructors for inviting me to come out and talk to you, and thanks for coming out and staying late on a Saturday. And yes, I'm the technical evangelist for the Adobe Creative Cloud ecosystem. And I have a whole separate talk about what that means. But just to give you the quick overview, basically with technical evangelism, developer evangelism, the idea is that one, I'm a servant of the developer community in general. So I've been known to go sit at hackathons and help people hack on things that aren't necessarily even related to Adobe technology. But at the same time, you also see me in places like hackathons or other events where we're sponsoring as API or SDK sponsors. And I'm there to help basically developers get the most out of our technology. So if at some point you have a question about this JavaScript API for the Adobe Creative SDK or something on Android or iOS, ideally I'm the person who can either answer that for you or help you get connected with the person who can answer that question. So today what I want to talk about, and it sounds like this is pretty timely, which I'm excited about, is learning about libraries. And we're going to use this term libraries sort of like very vaguely in the beginning, and then we're going to dive into a few other terms as well. But let's just stick with libraries for the moment. And I'll tell you why. Because a few years ago, up until about 2 years ago, I was living in Osaka, Japan. And I'd say if you wind the clock back about 5 or 6 years ago, I was teaching myself how to code at the time. And WordPress for me was sort of that gateway drug into like wanting to learn how to develop more. I was just a user for a while, and then I realized, go into that admin panel, you can just change some, what I didn't know were called like hex numbers in CSS, and suddenly you have different color for some element. And at the time, that felt really powerful, and I wanted to learn more and more. So I kept diving into it, but my guess is that most of you have been in that position at some point where you were kind of teaching yourself for a while, and then you realized, wouldn't it be awesome? Couldn't I learn much faster and more deeply if I was sitting in a room full of people who were interested in the same thing, and there were some awesome instructors to help me along the way? Well, in Osaka at the time, I didn't have access to that kind of thing. So the next best thing I could do was create a meetup in a workspace that I had, and hopefully with the idea of getting developers who were smarter than me to come in and hack on some projects and answer my questions. And luckily, we were able to do that. So we would have people come in once a month and just sit around, and it was like, it doesn't matter what language you're doing, what platform you're doing, let's just sit around the table and everyone bring in a project and just hack. And we'll designate time where we can just chat one-on-one. And during the course of that time, again, I'm still a self-learner at that point. I'm thinking, all right, I keep seeing this word library. What is that? So that's what we're going to talk about today, is kind of figuring that out. My guess is that at some point or another, you've seen this word while you're kind of hacking on different projects or while you're learning in some kind of classroom setting. But that's probably not the only word you've seen, right? You've seen all these other words as well: framework, API, SDK, library. And chances are, it seems like they're being used pretty arbitrarily, fairly interchangeably, right? What's the difference between an API and an SDK? When am I using a library? And what's a framework? Well, when I asked one of my buddies that at this meetup in Osaka, he said, don't worry about it. It's kind of too early in your path to really take on that baggage mentally of trying to pull these things apart. So just kind of run with the word library for the time being is what he told me. And I'm going to tell you the same thing right now. And the difference is that we're going to do this in a much faster pace. So for the moment, for the next few minutes, let's just run with the word library. And my guess is that some of you will be like, okay, he's using that in the wrong context. Don't worry about it. We'll go back and fix some of those things in a minute. But first, let's just start with the word library, one word at a time. So I want to tell you a story about you in the future. Let's say, for example, you're 6 months from now, a year from now, maybe a month from now. It could be that you were doing this yesterday, but you're off and you're a developer now, and you are working at a small startup with a really cool team of people hacking on this great project, right? And you've got some really cool ideas. You're going to build the next sort of like mobile app. And this mobile app enables your users to chat with one another, right? And you think it's the coolest chat app you've ever made, or that was ever made, not that you've ever made, but that was ever made in the history of the world. And that's really cool, but at the same time, one of the people on your team kind of raises her hand and says, wait a second, there's like 1,000 chat apps out there. How can we differentiate this product? Well, someone has this brilliant idea of adding a little bit of code into the app to differentiate. And this code basically figures out if the user is sad, and it makes the user stop being sad and start being awesome. Okay? Let's skip the details of how that's happening. But this is your differentiators. You're going to spread happiness throughout the world with this chat app. And so compared to other chat apps, maybe some other chat apps are making people feel sad or not making them feel anything. Yours makes people feel awesome. And that's a cool thing. So you're like, great, we're going to do this and we're going to ship this app. And so you do. Your team puts that app out there into the world and it becomes phenomenally successful. People are loving it because it's making them feel awesome. Why wouldn't they want to use that app? So your team is going to push a few updates to different bugs that have been reported, maybe add a few new features, but over time you're finding that your team now has the bandwidth to start looking at making other apps for this small startup that you're working at. And so that's what you're going to do. Next time, what you want to do is make an app that lets a user take a photo, edit the photo, and share the photo. Well, guess what? You have the same problem again, right? Where you're thinking, there's so many apps that already do this. How are we going to differentiate? Well, as you might imagine, your team, being the awesome team that it is going to spread that awesomeness to other people with that same chunk of code, that same piece of code, that same functionality that was working so well in your chat app. So this is pretty cool, right? Now you've got two apps out there in the world that are making a difference in some way in people's lives. But here's the thing. At this point, as a developer, probably some sort of red alert has gone off in your brain, right? Look at this. You can probably imagine what the problem is, right? Don't we often say in programming and in development, don't repeat yourself? The principle is dry, right? Well, that of course applies in a single app, but it can also apply across multiple apps. Think about it this way. If I have to make a change to that first app up there at the top in that functionality, I'm gonna have to make that same change in the bottom, right? Go down and remember, okay, you're in the heat of development, right? And it's one of these moments where you've got to make this change quickly. You've made the change to the chat app. Are you going to remember to make the change for the other app? Are you going to have to go in and copy and paste all this stuff?
Well, there's got to be a better solution. And one of the ways that you can solve this, and we're going to address this very simply, is by abstracting that out into a whole other chunk of code that both of those apps can reference, right? And there are multiple ways you can do this. We won't dig into that right now. But let's just assume you're able to do that. Well, congratulations, your team has just built a library. This is a reusable chunk of code that your team can go back and use again. So let's look at a larger, or sort of a different piece of this puzzle now. Here's a couple of students. There's some students at a university, they're going to a hackathon overnight over the weekend, and they've got this really awesome idea for an app that they want to hack in the next 36 hours. And what they're realizing is that it would be really cool if their app could help people stop being sad and start being awesome. Well, guess what? As things stand right now, they can't do that because there's a disconnect between what your company did, which was make this awesome technology in sort of the shape of this library. But one thing that you haven't done is make it open to the world, right? And so these students can't get access to this awesome problem that you've already solved. And in some cases, that's probably, you know, the right move for some kinds of technology. But for other kinds, why not go ahead and open it up? And if you can do that, then now what you've done is you've made this library that, of course, your company is using, but now other people out in the world are using too. And this doesn't have to be in the context of just a company. You can make libraries with your fellow students together, even starting today. And it doesn't have to be that a company's backing it. Often some of the best libraries are not backed by companies. The idea here is that somehow you can open that up, and there are various ways to do that. But then you are now offering this library to the world. You've solved this problem once, and if other people want to use this chunk of code as well, they're not going to be solving the same problem that you've already spent all of that time doing. Pretty cool, huh? So I want to give you a very quick demo of something that you've already seen. And this is cool that you've already seen it. I want to just kind of have a quick look at it. First, over here in my code base, I've got a very simple HTML document. There's all of this stuff is stuff you've seen before, right? It's, I've got the doc type, I've got the HTML tags, and inside of that, I have a head and a body. In the body, I have a button, right? And you can already imagine, I think, what this looks like. So if I go to my local host here, I have this website that's just a button, and there's nothing really very interesting going on here. These are pretty much default styles for a button in HTML in Chrome. So that's pretty awesome. But at the same time, it would be really nice if I could get some sort of really awesome styles very quickly without writing a ton of CSS. Well, how can I do that? Well, I have something in my head that you've probably seen before, and we'll have a look at it in just a second. But check this out. If I just do this and reload, I've already got some styles for free right there. Where are those coming from? My guess is that a lot of you have already seen this before, but any guesses as to how those styles just happened? I just put I'm sorry? Bootstrap, that's right. Bootstrap made by what company? Twitter, yep. Okay, cool, so you've all seen this. And you also know two things. One, Bootstrap doesn't only do classes for styles, although it does that and it does a lot of it. The other thing is that it's not exactly a library, but we'll dig into that in a second. But this is the cool part of it, right? Think about, for example, if I type this in, this is pretty sweet. Think about this in the context of like what all I'm getting. I've basically typed in 2 classes in my HTML. I'm getting all these styles. I'm getting border radius, I'm getting color, I'm getting both background color and text color. I'm getting hover handlers for those pseudo classes in CSS as well. And all I had to do was learn that Bootstrap can do that for me and then read the documentation to find out how. And in this case, it was, hey, add these classes. And then I can if I know all of those things, then I can go back and start learning even more about what else it can do for me. Like this. Pretty cool. We're going to dig in a little more later on about what else Bootstrap can do and why we won't necessarily leave it at calling it a library. But for the moment, let's stop there. And I want to think for just a moment together. We're going to have you actually kind of ponder this as your fellow students and colleagues here. What are the pros and cons of using a library? Why wouldn't you just want to write everything yourself? I think some of the pros and cons are somewhat obvious, but see if you can think of the benefits. Also try to think of some of the demerits of using something like this. And again, there's no right or wrong answer to these things, and that balance will be different for every product that you work on. But I'd just like to think about these for a moment together. So let's take 2 or 3 minutes and just chat with the person next to you. All right, cool. So can somebody just throw up your hands? Again, there are no right and wrong answers here necessarily. I just want to hear your thoughts on this. I don't even have an exhaustive list to give you. I mostly wanted to do this as a discussion. So pros, what are some good things about using libraries? It's faster, right? It's going to save you a lot of time. Again, with that Bootstrap example, I typed basically 2 words and I got all these styles for free. If I had dreamed that up in CSS, it might take me a lot longer to do. Any other benefits? Yeah, there's less code. It's true. I mean, it depends on the situation, but my guess is what you mean is there's less code that you have to write. That code still exists somewhere. It's just that, and that's one thing that is a potential demerit to using libraries as well. If you're, especially as a web developer, if you're throwing in a bunch of libraries and scripts without being a bit discriminate about how much weight that's adding to your web app, that can become an issue, right? And Bootstrap is an example of a library, we'll call it a library for now, that lets you modify exactly what you are adding to your own app. So the standard version of it, of course, is the whole hog, it's everything. But you can actually go in later on and fine tune that to get exactly just what you need. Cool. Any other pros? I've got one in mind. Decisions have been made for you. Yeah. So decisions have been made for you, and hopefully they're best practice. Not always the case, but you hope so, right? Yeah.
So all the bugs that we worked out, we've all told someone to left, and then you have an avalanche on your page, right? Mm-hmm. With something like Bootstrap, it's just been sweated so much that it works.
Yeah, that's often the case, right? Not always, but often the case. So something like Bootstrap, for example, a lot of sweat has gone into those details, so they've worked out a lot of the bugs before it comes to you. Right now, the version of Bootstrap that most of us would be using is Bootstrap 3. However, Bootstrap 4 has been in open development for quite a while now, and hopefully there are really smart people out there working out those bugs, so we don't have to deal with them. Did you have one?
Oh,
yeah.
Another pro. No, I was thinking of a con.
Okay, yeah, let's do it.
Compatibility.
Compatibility, in what situation?
Well, I was thinking of with Fedora, libraries for the video and audio if it would take non-free ones at all, setting that up.
Sure. So I haven't run into that issue before, but these are the kind of things that, depending on the library, we could definitely run into some compatibility issues. I authored a node module called Minuscule last year with contributions from about 10 different developers. And one thing was that it's a mean stack app generator. But one thing we didn't realize at the time was that the way that we were writing that script to initialize it wouldn't work on Windows. It had to be a POSIX compatible system. We were executing bash commands via node. And guess what? That doesn't always work in Windows environments. So there are situations where you have compatibility issues in certain situations. Sure. Any other comments? Yes.
It's easy to find a team of developers.
It's easy to do what?
It's easy to find like a team of people who will speak that language.
Right. So that is a pro and a con. Right. So basically, the good side of that is that, say for example, let's like React. You've all heard of React. You're probably already using it. React is now something that if your company is using it, then you can hire developers who have already been doing React. If you have a home-baked solution, that means that regardless of who you hire, you're going to have to ramp them up in whatever that is. The con, which I think is what you're mentioning here, is that if there's an exploitable bug in the thing that you are using, guess what? That's going to affect everybody using that, right? So that could be a potential problem, right? I think that there have been some recent good examples, and none of them are going to come to mind right now, but it is something to be wary of. Is my use of this library introducing bugs that, if discovered, will destroy my app or my user experience? Cool. So again, not an exhaustive list. This is something that you want to, when you're making those decisions, you want to weigh the balance, right? Is it worth it? Is it not? And in some cases it is. I want to show you some examples of websites that have used Bootstrap, for example, that have found this to be a great library, again, in air quotes, for their websites. That's one of them. So PayPal uses it. NPM, I think everybody here has Node installed, so you've probably done something with NPM before, usually via the command line, but NPM uses Bootstrap, as does Font Awesome. And hey, even my website does as well. And what I want to show you here is that, look at all this. If you know what Bootstrap looks like, you wouldn't even recognize this as being Bootstrap. You kind of have to dig into the guts of these websites to even know they're using it. And that's pretty sweet, right? What it means is that some of these tools, especially the UI tools, will often be customizable enough that you can use it. You can get like the goodness of whatever this particular library is doing. We'll dive into that in a little bit, without actually giving it away that you're using it and having your website look like every other website. Awesome. So we've been like really using this word library a lot, and I'm ready to stop doing that now. Well, not stop, but I want to be a little smarter about how I'm using it. So here we go. I told you earlier that I was in a situation at one time where it was like, wait, library, SDK, API, framework, like how are these things different? It sounds like you're just making up words as you go. Well, of course, words have meanings. And luckily, these all have pretty distinct meanings that we can unpack right now. And we can do it with examples. So I'm going to show you examples of how, kind of like in the web development world, of where you might use some of these terminologies. And we're not going to stop using library, of course, because it's a real word and it's useful, but we want to use it in the right way. So one library I'd like to tell you about the JavaScript that you should know and love if you're going to do a lot of JavaScript at all, either, especially on server side, I guess, is Lodash. Who here has heard of Lodash? Or its cousin. What's its cousin's name? Anybody know? There's one called Underscore. So they're kind of, I think, if I remember correctly, you can look into the history, but I think Lodash is an offshoot of it. This is a library that solves a bunch of pesky little problems that you'd probably rather not be solving yourself when you're trying to ship apps. So
here's a good example, basic enough, right? If you have a look at this code, basically in JavaScript, if I want to grab a random number, I'm at least going to be writing a couple of lines of code, but probably more. So I'm making a helper function here that's going to get a random number for me, return it. And this is assuming that I'm using integers, not even like floats and decimal points, right? If I wanted to do that, this particular helper function is going to get bigger and bigger. But still, if you ask me, it seems that getting a random number in a language should be a solved problem, right? Why do I need to write that helper function in every app I build? Some languages already have that solved more concisely, and that's fine. JavaScript chose to give you certain tools to work with, but at the same time, if you want to just know that you have a go-to function for that, anytime you need a random number, Lodash has you covered. It can replace all of that complexity at the top. And some of the complexity that I didn't even show you here, if you want to get really particular about how you're getting the random numbers, it's going to get rid of all of that. And that underscore there, that's the global variable for Lodash. So it looks kind of strange, but it's just a variable name. It could have been spelled out Lodash, but instead you use the underscore. It makes it super simple. And this is the heart and soul of libraries, right? This is basically what we're saying is, someone has solved this problem. It's a basic problem that we're going to have to solve over and over again as humans making software. So instead, we have a community-based project up online, and you can grab it and start learning all the different things that it does for you. And if you haven't ever tried Lodash, I think this is one of those Swiss Army knife types of libraries that you definitely want to be aware of. It can speed things up dramatically. That's a library. An example of one. Cool. Next up, I think that you all started talking about APIs today, so I'm pretty excited to kind of talk about this. And the word API can actually have a larger meaning, but in this case, we're specifically talking about REST APIs. So we're going to show you like just a quick diagram of how that works, right? So again, let's say, for example, you're making a mobile app of some kind, or again, this could be your client-side desktop web app as well, doesn't matter. But that web app wants to hit up the Meetup's API server. So I'm just using Meetup as an example, but there are a bajillion REST APIs out there in the world. And so this is the basic concept, right? Your client-side code wants to find out more, and this could actually be your server as well, but we're going to just talk client-side right now. So your client-side code wants to hit up the Meetup server to get some information, and what's it going to do? It's going to make a request, right? And the other side of that you've already seen today is that that server is going to provide a response. It can provide all kinds of responses. It can say, oh yeah, here's that thing you wanted, or I don't know what you're looking for, or yeah, we have that, but you're not allowed to see it, or our server is broken. All kinds of different responses can be made, right? And so, as you've probably already seen today, if you're just working straight up with the raw REST API, then what happens is that the provider of that service is going to define what URL endpoint you want to hit. And so in this case, the way Meetup's API is set up, let's say, for example, I want to find groups in Brooklyn. Well, guess what? The way I just said that in English is the way it's structured in that URL, right? It's /find/groups, and then with a query of, a particular zip code, but I happen to know that zip code. And that's the request. The response is going to come back looking like this. And what is this kind of response, by the way? I think yes, JSON, right? And in this case, if you notice, there's some square brackets on the outside of that. That means that it's an array of JSON objects. I could get potentially infinite amount of results from this API. And I've shortened the response. If you play with the Meetup API, it's pretty fun. It gives you a lot of really cool data on different groups. I think it's pretty fun anyways. But that's kind of the general idea with your REST API. Again, you're making a request and you're getting a response. Awesome. Next up, let's talk SDKs.
Has anybody here worked with an SDK before? A little bit? Which one? PayPal, cool. Same, PayPal? PayPal as well? Google Maps. Google Maps, cool. Okay, so these are all awesome examples of SDKs, and just to make sure everyone knows, SDK means Software Development Kit. What I want to give you an example of is the SDK that I evangelize, which is the Adobe Creative SDK. And in this situation, what you're seeing in the screenshot here is use of an SDK. You're calling a certain API, not a REST API, but you're calling a certain API. And what it's going to give you back is not just data, it's giving you back this whole UI component. And often this is what SDKs are going to do. Whereas with the REST API, you hit an endpoint and you get back some data. An SDK is going to offer a more robust experience for you, the developer, and then in some cases, like in the case of Creative SDK, also for your users. You're going to have to do very minimal amount of code in order to get this awesome image editor just to open up, and you're basically passing in an image and that's it. You don't have to build all the effects or the UI to show the editor itself. All of that's just baked in. And I guess what I'm trying to get across here is that the difference is the SDK will offer you as a developer more robust experience. Other examples of SDKs that are pretty famous are, iOS itself. As a developer, when you're interacting with it, that's an SDK, as is Android. So when you're diving into those, you'll start to realize, like, if you ever try some native development, you'll realize that those SDKs are giving you a lot of magic without you having to reinvent the wheel every time. And I think that that's one of the things that are pretty great about SDKs is that you can get a lot done very quickly. So in this example, you can see the usage of the Adobe Creative SDK's image editor is simple enough to get started. Basically what you're doing is you're making a variable, and I know based on the documentation that how I make a new instance of that image editor is making a new aviary feather, and I pass in a config object, right? After that, anytime I want to use that image editor, I just call CSDK image editor, or whatever my variable name was, .launch, and I get that image editor. Cool? So for this little amount of code, I get that whole image editor, and I'm not doing a lot of code to make that happen. That's an SDK. Last area I want to talk to you about is a framework. And so I kept telling you that Bootstrap, and you probably already knew this, but Bootstrap is, it's in some cases feel like a library, but really they self-identify, and I would agree, as being a framework. And we're going to talk about, first of all, what that means, what a framework means, and then we'll talk about what that means in the context of Bootstrap. So let's forget code for just a second and think about building a neighborhood. Say that you are in construction and you're building a new residential neighborhood out in the suburbs somewhere. Well, oftentimes, it happens to be that as you go down the row of houses and you're building these houses, there's a general framework in mind for that construction, right? They're not reinventing every house as they go, but they're actually using a certain framework. And so let's say, for example, what you see on the screen here, that's the framework. And each one of these houses is going to look like the same thing in the beginning. But then you, as the owner of the house, are going to want to move in. And chances are you don't want a house that's exactly the same as everybody else. And you want to customize that and do things to it to serve your own needs. So for example, you might put furniture in it. Of course you would, right? And it's not going to be the same furniture as everybody else. So you can, of course, customize the inside of it. You can add on extra rooms or a new garage or something like that. And guess what? If you have a house based on a framework like this, you can even make terrible decisions if you want to, right? You can customize it to the point of like showing off your own hobbies. Your neighbors are not going to like this, but you could do it. It's possible, right? And in the coding world, it's the same thing. If you're using a framework, basically the framework is there to sort of serve as like guiding posts of how you're going to build this out. But the insides and the outsides of it are up to you. So you can customize that to the experience that you want to build. And Bootstrap's a great example of a framework. It's not the only one, but let's say, for example, with Bootstrap,
We saw earlier how I can just add a class and get styles. Well, that's pretty simple. But what you probably already know about Bootstrap is that it does way more than that, right? What's its main feature? What is it most known for?
Yeah, mobile first or responsive design. I heard a few sort of, basically these are all the same answer. Yeah, layout, right? So that kind of thing where you're talking about, all right, no matter what screen this web page is viewed on, it should be optimized for that screen without me having to write the same code base 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or infinite times. And you can do this, right? And I'll show you a very simple example that you know, this isn't the full story, but the idea here is that if I want that button and all of its other HTML elements around it to display nicely on different screen sizes, you would know based on the documentation of Bootstrap that you're going to wrap it in a few different divs with special classes that are going to handle the screen size nicely. And so at this point, you might be thinking, right, and this is a simplified version of it, right? And so you might be thinking, wait, Ash, I thought that we talked about earlier, libraries in general are supposed to save me lines of code. But here you're showing me that I went from a basic button element to 5 lines of code, and you're also saying that's not even the whole story. True. Frameworks in general are a little bit different. There's a lot of code going on to make this stuff happen in the background, but when you're using a framework, it does necessarily imply that you're going to have to learn how that framework expects you to organize your code to get the benefits of it. Most of the time, well, I won't say most of the time, but of course, there's that pro and con that you have to weigh. But the argument for this kind of thing is that if you can learn it, the amount of code that is being used just for this class of row and class of column, you're not having to write any of that. It's all being given to you for free. So in some cases, oftentimes, the framework will sort of increase some of the code that you're going to have to write, but not when you compare it to if you really wanted to build a full-on responsive site all by yourself. This is actually saving you lines of code. So that's Bootstrap, an example of a framework using Bootstrap. Of course, there are plenty of other frameworks. My guess is that, like, let's just say, for example, what are some frameworks for client-side JavaScript? Yes, jQuery. Yeah, it's kind of borderline, right? It could be a library or a framework. What else? What else might we have in that world? Somebody just said something. Angular, yes, cool. I'm more like right now. That's the one that I usually default to when I'm writing JavaScript. But what's the one you all would learn? Yeah, React. Cool. There's all kinds of them, right? But that's kind of the general overview of these 4 different sets of words. So again, we're going to take just a brief break here to kind of talk about this together. So a couple of questions. First question, kind of who in your group or who in your surroundings has already used the library? In this situation, the answer is everybody. But let's kind of try to push that a little further. What frameworks, REST APIs, SDKs, and libraries have you used that maybe your partners aren't going to have seen before, or maybe they've forgotten about? Like, just take a moment to kind of show each other some of the stuff that you've used that's out there in the world. Might be an NPM module or a really cool REST API somewhere out there. Who knows? Go ahead and take a few minutes just to share that information.
Would you consider Node? These are not
something new. I mean, recently they were showing us how to use Swift filter. Yeah. I feel like those finding that's sweet. It made a lot of assumptions about like, how you're supposed to use it. Sometimes it's just sort of
People that construct just use it.
Well, and that's the thing is like, that's why I was being very specific about saying that the API. APIs right now. Anytime where you're going to specifically like in that situation, REST APIs. All right, cool. So let's share a little knowledge history. I'm personally very interested to find out what you all have been using anyway. So I asked earlier who had done SDKs. So we heard a little bit of like there's different SDKs out there like the PayPal SDK and Google Maps. I'd also mentioned iOS and Android being SDKs. You're doing ads on mobile, ad modules, one offered by Google. So we'll kind of skip over SDKs, but any REST APIs out here that people are using? What was that?
Spotify.
Spotify, cool. Spotify's a fun one, right? Playing around with music data. Yeah, Giphy, or Giphy, right? Yeah, that's cool. What else? YouTube, awesome. Very cool.
Oh, New York Times.
New York Times. That happened today, right? Maybe. It's already ancient history. Yeah.
Very cool.
All right, so great. So I mean, REST APIs, there's tons of them out there, and they're often like really fun to play with, right? Because you're getting the power of like all this data that some company or some group of people have amassed, and you can start to play with it in different ways. What about libraries? And I guess I'll move this in the direction of saying, because I know most of you are using Node, I believe. So what kind of NPM modules is libraries?
Color.
Colors?
Color.
What does that do?
So for plain text, in internal, allows you to have different colors for your text. So you can highlight, so internal, you can highlight the text, you can red, green, whatever.
Okay, cool. And that's an NPM module called Colors. Okay, awesome. There's also one called Chalk that you can use that will highlight your text in different colors. So that's really cool. I have a buddy who recently made one for the terminal. Now I'm going to forget what it's called, but basically you can pass in like a JPEG image, and it will give you a representation and like ASCII of like the colors and the picture right there in your terminal, just for fun, I guess. It was really cool though. You'll have to take my word for it because I forgot the name of it. Or node modules.
Jen, since you're an alumni, what are some of you use?
Oh, I would say
What's that one called? Loopback. What does that do? I want to try that. That sounds really fun. Awesome. Okay, Loopback. So setting up APIs via command line. That's really cool. What else? Any other ones?
Power.
Power. Awesome. Tell us what that does.
It brings in assets, so it can bring in Bootstrap, bring in material biology,
Yep. Cool. Power is a really popular option. Kind of like an NPM for the front end, I guess. Is like it's just another great way to like pull in packages and things like that that you're going to use on the client side. All right. Let's do one more. Anything else for NPM?
That was fascinating. Got Larry, right? Twitter, maybe?
Yeah. Well, there's all kinds of cool stuff out there anyways. I'd encourage you to keep playing around with it. Has anybody by chance used Lodash as an NPM module before? Yes, one person. 2 people? All right. Everybody should be using it. These are the kind of things that my best way of describing Lodash as a library is, again, like it's solving all of these problems that you shouldn't have to solve again. But a lot of these things, for example, like that random function that I showed you, some of these things are the kind of questions that you're going to be asked in job interviews if you're going to go out and do like the whiteboarding job interview as a developer. So those are also things that, like, if Lodash is solving that problem, you might want to learn how to solve that problem on your own in code, because the chances are you might be asked a question like that. But in a lot of ways, it seems like Lodash is like, it's basically solving all those whiteboard problems. So in the real world, you don't have to deal with it. Cool. Let's go over a quick, I want to give you a quick overview of the Adobe Creative SDK. I gave you a brief kind of snippet of what it does. We're going to dive into some code in a little bit, but I want to, before we do that, it's just best that you understand where we're going. So the Adobe Creative SDK is an SDK offered by Adobe. It lets you take your app, and we'll talk about what app means later, but it lets you take your app and become part of the Creative Cloud platform. So Creative Cloud, if you don't know, is a cloud that professional and even amateur creative users are storing their assets in. So like if you're at Photoshop, Lightroom, InDesign, Illustrator, all of those things, you're using those. Chances are, at this point in 2016, you are storing all of your assets up in the Adobe Creative Cloud. And up until a couple of years ago, Creative Cloud was there to let Adobe apps talk to one another, but it was entirely closed off. So do you remember the discussion earlier where I was saying you built a library and you weren't going to let anyone else use it? Well, we had a cloud that was like that, but we've opened it up, and the Creative SDK is the way that you can build an app that's part of that to serve creative customers. So basically it offers 3 areas of functionality. You can download things from Creative Cloud. You can access and offer robust creative tools like that image editor that I showed you. And you can let your users upload things from your app back into Creative Cloud. So just to break that out very quickly, we won't go over most of these in detail. When we're talking about download, most users will experience this via the asset browser UI component. This is coming to web very soon, but it's already on our other platforms. Basically with this, you can launch a UI in your web app that shows users the contents of their Creative Cloud account, and then they can choose something and download it straight into your app. And then with creative tools, we have things like the Typekit UI component, so users can access their fonts and use them in your app. Same with the image editor. This is the one we'll play with later. And we have more than that as well, but we'll just kind of leave it at those 2. And lastly, we offer the ability to upload in 2 different ways. One is the Send to Desktop API, which is super cool, because what it does is an endpoint you can hit. You pass it an image, and it stores that in the user's Creative Cloud account, but it doesn't stop there. So imagine, for example, I'm a user, and I'm on my phone, right? I'm in your app, and I push a button saying, hey, I want to work on this in Photoshop. Push that button, saved in Creative Cloud. But it goes on from there, and it actually pushes straight to desktop, where it opens up Photoshop on your desktop, and that image is boom, already ready to go for further work. You can do that in Photoshop, Illustrator. And of course, we have the
the Creative Cloud REST APIs as well. So if you want to do something other than sending to desktop, you can do that as well. So all of that together, those areas of functionality are what make up the Creative SDK. It supports iOS, Android, and web. And as of a couple of weeks ago, I've been working with one of the developers on the Adobe PhoneGap team to bring plugins to PhoneGap for the Creative SDK. So as a web developer now, if you want to build apps, write apps in JavaScript, and then launch them, sort of deploy them to native platforms for Android and iOS, you write in JavaScript, type in a terminal command, and now you've got a native app. And PhoneGap has always offered that, but now you can actually access the functionality of the Creative SDK from your PhoneGap app. And all you got to do is write JavaScript. So if anyone happens to be interested in PhoneGap stuff, you can talk to me about that later. We won't go into that at all, but we've got all kinds of different partners that work with us. So maybe you've heard of Paper 53. They're like an app that lets you draw things on mobile. They use our Send to Desktop API. So if you're going to try that out, I'd recommend that in particular. So that pretty much wraps it up. If you want to get more information, I'll give you the stuff later as we go on into the coding portion of it, but creativesdk.com. We have a GitHub page, creativesdk.github.io. I've been making lots of repos with our developers in the Creative SDK team, so the cool thing about that is that you don't even have to code anything. Just try it out, go fork something, clone it locally, and run it. That's it. So a few things that I'd let you know about if you're into going to meetups and events. I do a lot of that kind of stuff. There's one called AM Dev Salon that I am just now getting started. More on that soon, but if you want to find out about it, I can give you the link to the meetup.com page. Coffee and Coding Conundrum is a monthly coding thing that I mentioned to you earlier. That was the one that I started in Japan. There's 2 cities in Japan that do it, and then we do it in New York as well, usually at the eBay offices in Chelsea. And then lastly, if you're someone who thinks you're going to go on here to look at like founding a new startup or something like that, and you want to meet other people who are going through that same experience, Founders Friday is a meetup that I co-organize in the West Village every Friday morning. It starts at 9:30, so you're going to make it in time, but it's definitely worth the while if you're someone who's interested in founding a company. We bring in founders who have seen success, either in terms of making big companies or selling their companies. We also bring in VCs from the local ecosystem to share knowledge with founders about like what they're looking for when they fund companies. Those are just a few things that you might search for if you're interested in kind of getting out there and going to meetups. But that's all. I want to say thanks a lot for your attention and your participation in this. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you for having me, and thanks to the instructors. Yeah, why don't we take a few minutes, and then we can, if anybody wants to, I'll go through a live coding session to show you how to get up and running with that image editor. We'll go through and basically it's client side, so no server side code needed. We will just pull in jQuery to make it pretty simple to get started. But I'll give you the idea of like how you can use it. So let's come back in about 5 minutes or so.
Hi.
Hey, how's it going? Andrew, nice to meet you.
What were you doing in Osaka?
What was I doing? Well, in Osaka, I was working for a startup over there for a while.
That doesn't sound fun. Maybe it was. My impression of Japanese companies is bad.
No, it wasn't really all that great.
I worked in Tokyo and it wasn't fun at all.
Yeah. Yeah, I did that for a couple of years. I helped them. I mean, I liked what I was doing. I helped them basically take the Japanese product, get it ready for the American market, and then launch it in San Francisco.
That sounds fun, but awful and daunting.
Yep.
Because they don't know it.
Yeah, basically after a couple of years, I went on to start my own company.
Wow.
And so I was working kind of digital nomad stuff remotely. Yeah.
just wanted to ask you. Other
Yeah,
people have
cool.
questions.
What were you doing in Tokyo?
Sales for an ERP company
Okay. Killer.
was awful.
How's it going? Yeah, nice to meet you. Yeah, thank you. Oh, yeah, yeah. Oh, no worries. That was more than enough. Thank you so much. Yeah. I was just like, one of those things where I had the GPS on, like, most of the morning, and I realized once I got here, I have the black version of that Amazon. It's pretty good.
Yeah, I had some before too. I wanted to get this. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks a lot. Keep going. Yeah. Were you the person who would
I grew up in Tokyo.
Okay. Hey, thank you. Kind of long story, but I like the way I ended up, I was living in San Francisco. Oh, it was on? Okay.
Yeah, I was actually
Where is it?
it's
Sorry.
what I kind of go into.
Okay. I don't. So well. I could have took yeah, it's actually pretty cool. Yeah. Yes. Trying to get everybody up here so I don't have to be on quite as loudly. Yeah. No, I used to live in I lived in New York. I wish you knew.
I have all they talk about is
Yeah, it's true. It's very rural, but I love it. That's kind of fun. Yeah. Interestingly, like I lived in Japan for 3 years before I ever. So I feel when I first moved there, I really didn't know that was all I knew. Nothing is good about it. It's just like the world isn't it? It's a good starting point. Mine just happened to be. You ever get a chance to explore this? Yeah, I mean that's kind of just a more rural places like kind of tend to produce the kind of person who has some time to chat with you. Yeah. This wasn't just like the big city in the future, but going from Tokyo, you would be like, it's you would be surprised.
It's not that much bigger than Hiroshima, which I have been to. Hiroshima definitely feels nice.
Yeah.
I can't imagine.
I moved to Hiroshima in December actually. I've been before. I kind of have an idea of what to expect, but it's been like 10 years.
Oh wow. Probably
What, Hiroshima in general?
I have friends that are like doing gym now. Not just Hiroshima, out there. But fun. I like to chill with it.
No, you know, luckily for me, the gender, it's pretty much standalone. It's pretty by the way, like before we start, if you're gonna hack on us, find an image. We need a JPEG. Just grab one. We're gonna need it later. I don't have a JPEG to give you, so grab one offline or photo library.
I will never do that.
Just have it ready. We'll drop it into the project in a bit.
That's not even something you need prep for. You didn't even know. That is the number.
I'm going to do it. Another thing that I will mention in a little bit, but you're going to need some kind of like local HTTP server. If you have a Mac, you're already good. If you're on Windows, it's probably best. If you have Python, I can show you how to do it. If you don't, and you have Node, there's a module that you can install. I can show you that. Do you have Python on here? Okay, you do have Node. Okay. I'll show you what this again. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Thank you. So, both of you have already as well? Yes. So, I'm going to show everyone real quick about that. Are you showing them? Okay, I was about to. Cool.
So just for the Windows folks real quick, just to make sure that you're set up, if you have Python, I can show you how to do that in just a moment. If you don't have Python, cool, but you do have Node, right?
We all have.
So what I would like you to do with Node in this case is npm install globally a module called, oh, let me spell that right, http-server. Only for Windows, yeah. On Macs, if you want to do this, go ahead. But for Macs, you already have Python and it has its own HTTP server baked into it.
Macs come with Python?
Apparently so. I didn't know that until yesterday. Because I usually use this npm module. This is the one I use, but it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, Andrew, anything that has Bash. What? Bash. Oh,
So do you know that, like, so recently it seems like Windows has started to ship with Bash or something.
I'm using it right now.
So you actually get Bash.
It's real Bash.
Awesome. So you can, that's why you have it. Okay.
No, it was the anniversary update.
Wait, is that Windows 10?
Windows 10.
Okay, I'm just trying to be aware of these things. There's somebody.
It's using to get the Bash terminal, so all the terminology for using like yeah, so instead of Conqueror, so app the contact okay, it's pretty much the same package. Yeah, that's about it. Because there's much more that
Yeah, not just anyway.
That is one of the most popular ones out there.
Once you have HTTP server installed, remember you need to install this globally for it to work. What I want to do for the HTTP server crew is just to check this real quick, but the command that you want to type is HTTP server. If you type that in, you should just now be serving localhost 8080 from whatever directory you're already in. Don't worry about actually using it, but if you type in HTTP server and it looks like you're serving up a home page, then you're good. This is for the HTTP server crew. Basically, you should just get a dialog in the terminal that says that you're now serving, and that's all you need to check. For Python, what's the best way to do this? I had seen this yesterday. Might be good to Google it. Yeah, this is the one I found yesterday. The command that you need to know is pretty simple anyways, and this is already installed. Where is it? Ah, here it is. So if you're not using the node module that we just looked at, and you're using Python instead, you can just type in python-m and then simple HTTP server. I assume it's case sensitive, I don't know. In this case, it's going to default to serving on localhost 8000. That distinction doesn't matter what we're doing today. Because again, we're not even going to write client-side code. We're not going to write server-side code. But for those dependencies on the client to work, we need to be serving from an actual server locally. Yeah. Oh, let me show you one, I guess.
Yeah.
It's a good point. Just side by side, if you're going with that node module route that I showed you, it's npm install globally http-server. That's going to globally install an HTTP server. Super simple one. It's just if you're hacking on local projects often, I actually have an alias for this in my terminal profile just because I use it so much. Just type in htest, I'm certain. If you're doing a lot of like just quick hack projects to different things, it might be worthwhile file to store an alias at some point, but let's not mess with that today. So again, if you're gonna serve from the node module, it's npm install -g for global and then http -server. And if you're gonna go the Python route, it's that command you see there in the browser, python-m, simple HTTP server. These are tools that if you want to learn more about them, they offer more depth than what we're gonna do with them today. All we need is the default server as it is. Sweet. One thing I probably should have mentioned before we settled in is make sure that you're close enough to your neighbors that you can kind of talk to each other, because I'm going to punctuate this whole session as we go with time for you just to like soak it in and try it out. And better that you can communicate with someone sitting next to you, just in case you kind of like, you meander off or your part, someone sitting next to you does, you can both kind of like get back on track. So if you're not right next to someone, I would highly encourage you to get right next to someone.
Okay, so I mean, the first steps of this are going to be like the first steps to everything you've done on the client side. So it's going to just kind of get through that part of it. Go ahead and cd into a directory that you want to build your project in. So, like for example, I'm already good where I am, but you could put this on the desktop or wherever you want. Wherever you are, go ahead and make a new directory by typing in the make dir command. I'll try to, if at any point something's too small, just go ahead and let me know. I'll try to keep it as big as possible. So go ahead and make a directory. It doesn't matter what you call it. This is just going to be the parent directory for the whole project. I'm going to call it image editor. And then I'm going to cd into that image editor. So at this point, if you list everything in the contents of that directory, you should have exactly nothing. Well, without using the -a command, of course. So, whoops. The next thing we want to do is go ahead and get set up with all the various boilerplate that you probably already know we need, which is we've got to have, first of all, an index.html. So go ahead and create that file. And fastest way to do that is to touch index.html. So again, if you list the contents, you're going to have an index.html there. Cool. Next thing you want to do is go ahead and open index.html into whatever text editor you're using. Quick show of hands. Sublime Text users, WebStorm, Visual Studio, Brackets, anything else? Atom? Cool. Any Dreamweaver users in here? No? Okay.
Oh, Adobe.
Just thought I'd ask. Cool. So I'm going to be working in Sublime Text today. And what I'm going to do here is go ahead and open up that index.html file that we made. And you already know that we need boilerplate. So like, for example, I have this thing in Sublime Text. Maybe all Sublime Text has it that just gives you the boilerplate. But you need your doc type, you need your HTML tags, head, body. And just so we don't get out of the habit of doing it, we may as well go ahead and give it a title. It's not super important today. You can call it whatever you want. I'm calling it image editor. And once you've done that, let's go ahead and give it an h1 tag in the body. And we'll say hello world. That's what we're supposed to do. Cool. So this is a great time to go ahead and practice using that server that we just talked about. So if you're using the node module HTTP server, go ahead and go back to your terminal, type in HTTP-server and hit enter. At this point, you should be serving on port 8080, but if you're not, just look and see what port it says in your terminal. And if you're using the Python one, that's Python-m, and I think it was this. I'm gonna just type that and just see if it works. Yeah. If you're using the Python one, it's gonna serve on port 8000 by default. That's fine. I'm gonna go back to the HTTP server one. And if you do that, you go into your browser, type in localhost : and then whatever port your server is serving on. You should just see hello world in the serif font default to your browser. Is anybody not seeing that? And like I said, feel free at this, this is one of those punctuation points where go ahead and just check with your neighbor real quick. If they don't see a hello world, help them out. I'll bring my similar text back up.
Or whatever you call that file. Wait. Or you can start,
Did I switch back to the online file? I had two windows open at the same time.
Oh, that's fine. You had it open from before. You had it open from like before.
Yeah, I got it from before, and I went and tested it. This not the first time that's happened.
Same.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, wherever you go. So let's go back and do I hold it. And then here, yeah, the browser. You actually want to have like the nice thing about anything like this. This is where that hybrid got it.
After that, it's like, so I mentioned earlier to some of you that we need to have an image. So if you don't have an image, grab one. Preferably you're going to use a JPEG. Our image editor can handle JPEGs and PNGs, but let's just go with JPEGs. Make sure that,
Offline or online?
preferably it's local. You can use the image editor to grab images from other locations, but for our purposes right now, I want to show you how to do it locally. So go ahead and have that image ready, and I'll show you where to store it. Just make sure you've got the JPEG ready to go. Oh, that.
It's definitely.
So for those of you that are comfortable working in multiple terminal tabs, you can leave your server running the whole time in one tab and then work in the other. For the purposes of demonstration, I'm going to be bouncing back and forth. Just be aware that if you've got two tabs open, that just don't forget that the server's already running, and then like if you try to run it again, it could cause problems. So anyways, I'm going to bounce back and forth in the same tab, but you're welcome to do whatever is comfortable for you. So again, the contents of our current directory right now, all we have is an index.html. Let's go ahead and make a new directory. And let's call it images. This is only going to store one image, but you can imagine that it will probably store more. So again, if you have a look at the contents of that directory, now you have index.html, and you have a directory called images. Could be called anything, but we called it images. The next thing you want to do is, as you might imagine, that image that I asked you to prepare, go ahead and move it into that directory in whatever way is easiest for you. In this case, I'm going to just do it in the Mac Finder by dragging. Spelling correctly. So if I do that, and I list the contents of that images directory, I can see that my JPEG image, and remember it should be a JPEG for our purposes right now, should just be in there. So super basic HTML question, but how am I going to show this in my web page? Right. So like, if I go over to my web page here, I've got this hello world H1. What am I going to do next? Just to show a basic image in an HTML document. Right. You just want to use an image tag, and remember, image tags close themselves, so you don't have to do it. What do I? Again, since I'm just assessing kind of comfort level here, but like, what am I going to do? We're going to type in source. Very good. Right, awesome. So in this case, like, you're going to type in the name of the directory you just created. The one I created was called images. Perhaps yours is too. And then the name of your image. So if your image has some crazy name because you pulled it off the internet and it's untypable, I would suggest renaming it. Cool. So at this point, you've got an H1 that says hello world and an image tag that points to that local image in your directory, images/. That doesn't matter, and it depends on what your image is.
So you say it's saved that way. Yeah.
Exactly. So if I went into my Finder and took that E out, my computer's not going to complain about it. Then I would just have to take the E out here too. Yeah. So JPEG can have an E or not an E. Just make sure that they match. Cool. And if we want to test if this is working, run your HTTP server again. Don't be confused by when I type HS in my terminal. That's just an alias I have. You should type HTTP-server. It does the same thing. Once you've done that in Node HTTP server or Python server and you reload, you should have the beginnings of a very ugly web page. You have an H1 tag and an image. Untamed, probably cute. That's okay. This is another moment that we're going to take that punctuation and go ahead and just check with your partner and see if they have an image in their browser. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to the next step, which the first thing that we're going to do, we already know that later on in our JavaScript, when we start writing JavaScript, we're going to need to get this image element, and we want to be precise about it. How can we set up our HTML so we can later target this image element precisely? Use an ID. And let's go with something pretty generic in this case, because we know we're only going to have one image for today. We'll just call it ID image. That could be anything. It could be ID banana, I don't know. But we're going to call it image so we can remember later how to grab it. And I think at this point we're past the hello world stage. So let's go ahead and change that too, so it's at least clear later on like what we were doing. So I'm going to call it image editor. And if your server's still running, like mine is, then you can just go reload the page and your H1 should have updated. No big surprises there. If it hasn't updated, just remember to hit save in your text editor. Sometimes that's easy to forget. One more thing I want to do in HTML before we move on to some JavaScript, which we'll do very shortly, is this. Head back over to your text editor, and eventually when we want to edit this image, we're going to need to push a button to make that image editor pop up. I mean, you don't have to make it a button. It could be anything, but for the sake of simplicity, let's go with the button. Makes the most sense here anyways. In your HTML, make a button element, and then I would recommend just using the text edit. If you save that and your server is already or still running, go ahead and refresh. Somewhere on this page should be a button. It's all the way at the bottom left. It's tiny. That's okay. We're not really super worried about how this looks right now. We're going to make it work first, and then we're going to make it look nice. Making it look nice to me the extra credit. For now, just make sure you have a button on the page somewhere. And for everybody in the room, in case you're having trouble seeing where it landed on my page, it's like way down here behind the camera.
That was just a button tag edit.
That was just a button tag with the word edit inside. Hey, does anybody know, like, what can I do to, for now, without doing anything fancy, force that image onto the next line after the button? Yeah, I want to put in a break. And so this is not a requirement, but if you want to do it, you can do it. It's a self-closing tag. Sometimes you're going to see people writing it like this when they want to help themselves remember that it closes, but you don't necessarily have to do this. I generally don't. If you do that, that break HTML element here has forced a line break after the button. So now you can see the buttons up here at the top. It's a little easier to see. Guess what? It does nothing. We're going to build that functionality. There's one final thing that I think I need to do in my HTML to prep me so I'm set up to do some awesome JavaScript here in a second. Any ideas? It has to do with that button. That's right, I need an ID, because in my JavaScript, I'm going to need to target that button. And the best way to do that precisely is with an ID. And so I'm going to go with the ID simplicity. I'm going to just call it edit. In real life, I'd probably go with edit button. But for this, considering that we're pretty much done with our HTML, there's no reason to get too complicated. So I'm just going to go with the ID edit. So this is the full extent of the code that you should have right now. The next thing that we're going to do is actually go on to set up our JavaScript. And for the purposes of today, to keep things relatively simple,
is to use jQuery. Some people love jQuery, some people don't love it. I don't have strong opinions necessarily. jQuery is fine for a project like this because we've all used it a little bit, and it's sometimes easier to read for some people than vanilla JavaScript. And it's way easier for people than just jumping into a framework. So let's go with jQuery for today. If you want to try to get interest in do vanilla JavaScript, by all means, that's an option.
But I'm going to show you how to pull in jQuery. Everybody here, well, what should we do? I'm thinking about doing NPM, but we could also just pull the CD in.
Everyone here has Node, right?
Yes.
Okay, let's just do that then.
Let's try it. If it doesn't work, then we'll go the CDN route, and I'll show you what that means later. But let's try it with Node. What do I need to do in my terminal to install jQuery into this project? Has anybody got a, I think you all know it anyways. Sure, cool. So npm I jQuery, and in this case, I'm just going to type it all the way out so it's very clear what we're doing. But npm install, you can shorten that to I if you like. But npm install jQuery. And if you're going to put this project on GitHub or whatever, we're not going to do that today, but if you wanted to make this reproducible, what else would you put in the command here? -- save, right? I'm sorry? Of course, yeah, I totally forgot about that. Let's do that first. Let's go ahead and initialize our project. Thank you for reminding me. What does -y do? Sweet. Fewer questions, right? So here we go, npm-y. Sorry, npm init-y. That's awesome. So all we've done so far is just like set up an npm project. Nothing has actually changed in terms of functionality for our project yet. We're just paving the way to get jQuery into the project. Next thing we want to do is npm install --save. That's optional, but generally recommended. And then jQuery. I'm not going to hit enter yet, but you can go ahead if you want to get it start installing. So we did npm init -y. -y was a shortcut. Save us from answering a bunch of questions that we usually have to answer. And then npm install --save jQuery. So those were the two commands. I hope you're at that point. I'm going to hit enter, and then all the things are going to start happening in my terminal too. Cool. So we've got to get this jQuery into our project somehow. This part, I don't see the need to kind of go over it step by step. This is something I'd rather you do with your partner. And I'm going to go ahead and do it up here too, so you can watch. But go ahead and start discussing this with your partner. Like, how are you actually going to get npm, the script itself, into your HTML document? The HTML is up there if you want to have a look. It should be the same for everybody.
You might want to discuss with the person sitting next to you as well, like how can you check to make sure that jQuery is actually being accessed in your browser. And it involves using DevTools.
Yeah, check the console. So if you've gotten that far, you can open up DevTools in Chrome or whatever you happen to be using. I can show you what it looks like in Chrome, which is unfortunately quite small. But you want to head over to that third tab that says Sources. You see how it says Elements and then Console and then Sources. You can check from there. Inside of localhost, you're probably going to you should have a directory that says images, but you should also have a directory that says node modules / jQuery / dist, assuming that you're using the same directory structure for the node module that I am. Do you see how I have that exactly here in my HTML, and then it's showing up here in DevTools? If you don't have that second directory, then that means you have some sort of problem. So please check with your neighbor to make sure that's set up as well.
It's interesting that you had it maybe anyone else not seeing jQuery?
Okay, we're gonna do one more thing to verify that everyone's kind of like on the same page in terms of having jQuery ready to go. The next thing that we want to do is get started writing some JavaScript. And we're gonna do that by heading back over to the terminal. Should be in the top level of your project here. Your project now has a directory called images. It has index.html. It has a directory called node modules and a package.json. Next thing we want to do is go ahead and we're going to put everything just up in the top level of the directory. You might not do this in a normal project, but for something like this, there's no reason not to. We're going to go ahead and make a script by touching index. Could be called anything. I'm calling it index.js. When you do that, now you're going to have a new file called index.js. Should be available to you in your text editor as well. in your text editor, let's open up that file and try something out. So generally, like when we're writing some jQuery, there's kind of a boilerplate that we're going to put into jQuery files at the beginning, oftentimes, to make sure that everything is ready to go before we start trying to do any JavaScript. What is that? Yeah, it's document.ready. And so the way that we write that, and this is just kind of a wrapper around everything else we'll write, just to make sure that everything's in order before we start trying to use any JavaScript, is we're going to do this $sign. What does $sign mean in this case, by the way? Yeah, it's just an alias for jQuery. It means you could type jQuery there too. So document.ready, I believe, and then we're going to pass it an anonymous function like this. You can also write what? Sorry?
Just function.
Okay. So I want something to happen when I click that button. And all we're going to do at the beginning is console log. Eventually, we're going to have an image editor open up, but we're going to build to that step by step. So what am I going to do to make that something like a console log happen when we click the button? I guess I don't want you to answer me directly. Instead, why don't we have you, before I start typing anything, go ahead and write that functionality into your app. Do this with your partner. I'd rather not see anybody just kind of coding in silence. Like, discuss this. What are you going to do to make it happen?
Yeah, just a console log.
Aha, good point. Thank you for bringing that up. Even if you successfully write a click handler, it's not going to work because we skipped a step. And someone just said it, but I want to hear somebody else. What have we not done? Like your index.html does not have access to index.js, so we've got to make that happen too. So be sure to go back into index.html and add that file. And you can do that down here where we already included that script earlier, right? The order here is important, of course, because we want to load jQuery before we load our own script, since our script uses jQuery. Ahoy. Cool. This is what your HTML should look like. I'll put it up side by side with the JavaScript as well, if Sublime Text will let me. Where did it go? This might be quite hard because my screen is gigantic right now.
Put it on the top of each other. One on top.
Yeah, what's the keyboard shortcut for that? Yeah, let's see if I can figure it out. Here we go. Thank you, that's what we want. So the inclusion of the script tag here is the thing that's highlighted. then within your index.js, you have a click handler. Do you see how I have that, what's basically the hash edit there? That's referring to that ID on the button. If you use a different ID, which I've seen some of you did, it's fine. Just be sure that you're matching ID to ID. So in my case, I did ID edit, which means that I'm going to do hash edit right here. Okay, we're about to leap over to start pulling in that Adobe Creative SDK image editor. So we just want to make sure we've got everything in order before we go on. And what I'd like you to do is check with your partner real quick to see if when they hit that button, go ahead and just click their button for them and see if that console log actually happens. It's important to make sure that our click handler is working as we expect. Yeah. Okay, I think we're pretty much ready to go. Let's head over and we're going to actually figure out how now to pull that image editor into our web page that we're getting started creating here. So now we just need to go to our browser, and like most APIs or SDKs, you're going to need a client ID or an API key in order to identify your app to our service, so we can verify that you're who you say you are. Pretty easy to set up. Head over to creativesdk.com. Creativesdk.com. In order to get an API key, you're going to click at the top here where it says My Apps. And unless you happen to have used this SDK before, that means you'll need to create an account. I already have one. But go ahead and create an account. Once you've made the account, on the other side of that, there's a button that says New Application. That big blue button. You're going to want to click that. That's going to give you an API. So there's yeah, if you don't see My Apps, then what that means is that you want to go to login, and from
there you'll have the greatest skills. So again, right now we're just creating an ID if you don't have one. So after you've created the ID and you're logged in, that's when you should actually see this My Apps item up in the menu there. That's what you want to click on. And where I have a bunch of apps for like Android and iOS and web and whatnot, you should have nothing at this point. Feel free to go ahead and create a new application. It should be relatively self-explanatory. The main thing you want to make sure of is that you're making a new web app, not a new iOS app, because we're building for web. Don't spend too much time on the description. It should be really short anyways. And basically, you just put in something like records that you need on for what our purposes are today. Yes, it is web. Be sure you're making a web app. On the other side of that, you're going to get a client ID, aka an API key. Save that somewhere. Put it in a text editor. Put it somewhere where you're not going to lose it. We need that in just a moment. So at this point, you should have made a web app, and our website should have given you a client ID. That's something that you're going to need access to in a little while, so put it somewhere in your computer where you can grab it real quick. Maybe you just open up TextEdit or Notepad and slap it in there for a second, and later we're going to put it back into our web app. Sweet. So if we're going to use this script, what's the first thing that we need to figure out how to do? I mean, this would have nothing to do specifically with the SDK, but in general. We want to use this functionality. We're going to use it as a script. So what do you think we need to do first? What are we looking for? What did we do with jQuery? Right. So in this case, we're not going to install a package because we're going to pull it off of the web instead using Adobe CDN. So let's figure out how to do that. We're going to head over to documentation. So of course, when you're learning about a new library or an SDK, the documentation is the place you want to head. And here on our website, we have a documentation tab, and we can click through to the web SDK by clicking web documentation.
what we're looking for is the script tag that we can put into our HTML to get going. We'll look here at the Getting Started page. Of course, the Getting Started page has at the top a preview of what it is that you're going to be getting by virtue of using this image editor. We'll just keep scrolling down until we find it. And here it is right here, the editor JavaScript URL. I'm highlighting it right here in my browser. So I'm going to grab this URL here. It says feather.aviary.com/imaging, so on and so forth. Go ahead and grab that URL, and then let's take it over to our HTML. So you can see here in index.html, I'm going to go ahead and put that just before our script tag for the index.js that we added earlier. So you can see here, I'm highlighting in index.html the line that I just added, which is including that script that we just pulled from the Adobe webpage. Documentation web, and then getting started. Once you've included that, remember how we checked this in DevTools earlier in Chrome to see if that script is actually getting pulled in? If you're already there, go ahead and check to see if that's happening. In your DevTools, if this image editor is being pulled in, you're going to see feather.aviary.com. Okay, we're getting pretty close to where we're actually going to have this image editor up and running. We've gotten this setup done. So you can see here in our index.html, we have 3 scripts now. We have jQuery, we have the image editor script from feather.aviary.com, and we have our own index.js. So go ahead and head over to your index.js. We're going to start adding some code there. And the first thing that we need to do is actually get that image editor set up. And we'll do that by creating a new variable when the document loads. I'm going to call this CSDK image editor. You can call it whatever you like. In order to instantiate that image editor, to get it up and running, we're going to type in new and then aviary.feather. And then inside of that function call, we're going to pass in an empty object just for the moment. So what that empty object does is it lets us as the developer just provide some basic settings for that image editor, the way it's going to behave, and in some cases the way it's going to look, what features are offered. We don't need to dive into all that right now, but the one thing that we need to do is make sure that we're providing our API key. So let's go ahead and do that. The way that we do that is by passing in the API key to this configuration object, like this. API key, this is camel case. And then we're going to pass in a string. This is that client ID that you picked up from the Adobe website just a moment ago.
I noticed you're using the dev version of the secret key and especially using the key instead.
Yeah, just the dev key for this. For what we're doing today, you don't need the secret key. It is reserved for web developers who want to take advantage of our high resolution API. That's also free to use, but it does require writing server-side code, which we won't dive into. If you're interested, I have a GitHub repo that you can check out later. You just want the dev key, not the secret. Awesome. We're about a step away from actually launching this thing. So what we've done so far is just configure, or actually just instantiate the image editor, but we're actually going to have to pass it an image in order to open it up. So let's do that now. We're going to come down here. Remember that when we click that button in our HTML, that's when we want the image editor to launch. So of course, we're going to now start writing code inside of that click handler that we wrote earlier. So where I have my console log here, you can take that out if you want. I'm going to leave it in. And inside of there, we're going to do this. Use that variable that you set up for the Creative SDK image editor. And what we're going to do next is there's a function available on that object called launch. I'm pretty sure you can imagine what that's going to do. As it stands right now, that should do nothing for you, right? Because why? Why do you, just like logically thinking about what we've set up so far, we're launching the image editor, but what have we not told it? Where's the image? So let's set that up. And there's a bunch of different ways that we could do this, but we're just gonna handle it all in the click handler for now, just because our use case for our sample app here is gonna be quite simple. So let's make a variable, and we're gonna call it, let's just call it image, I guess. No, I'm gonna call it target image, just to be clear about what I'm doing. How can I access that target image? jQuery. You remember earlier, check out in the HTML here where we included our image. We gave it an ID. My ID here is image, simply enough. So what I'm going to do here, all right, hash image because it's an ID. Now, here's one peculiar thing about jQuery that we're not going to dive into this, but what you should be aware of is that when you use jQuery to get an element, you're not just getting that element. You're getting all kinds of good stuff that jQuery provides for you, but in this case, we just want the image. And so without diving into the guts of jQuery too much, what I can tell you is that if you do this, by getting the 0th element of the array, you are going to get just the image and that image alone. The element itself. What we're doing here is saying that we don't want the jQuery object, we want the image. Awesome. So let's go back down here to that CSDK image editor.launch call. Inside of here, we need to pass it an object. So you can put an empty object in that call. This is where we're going to tell the image editor where that image is. And we want to do that in 2 ways. it should have, this object that we just made should have two properties. The first property should be image. The second property should be URL. Just imagine well, let's do this. So for image, basically what I'm saying here is that if you read the documentation for the image editor, what we need to do is pass it the ID of the image. How can I pass it the ID of the image? Well, I can use target image.id. Cool. All that's doing is passing the ID. What do you think I can do for URL? Well, target image.src, so source. The result is the same as what you were thinking, but in this case, we need to type in src.
Target image is part of jQuery?
No, target image is this variable that I made up here on line 10.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so what we've done here instead is we've kind of, just by, out of necessity, we needed to get out of jQuery land just to be able to pass the image itself. So that's why we have the square brackets with 0 after that image. So we use jQuery to grab the image element, but we don't want that whole jQuery object because the image editor doesn't need it. We just need the image element. So really what we're doing on lines 13 and 14 is we're using the JavaScript. So we're grabbing that element, at this point, this is going to be sort of the grand unveiling to see, because it's been a while since we've actually checked what's going on in our browser. So let's find out. It could be this is working, or it could be it's not. In my case, it is. How about you? I showed you it's working, so I'll put the code back up so you can kind of check out what we've done. Mostly this all happened in JavaScript, so you'll want to have a look at that second file I have open. If it's not working, check that variable that we made for the image editor passing in the API key. Also check your launch function call to make sure that it's doing what it should be doing. And I'll come around and give people a hand to talk about it. Yeah, so if you're noticing problems like that, we just haven't set it up yet. So yeah. Right now, by the way, on purpose, you have no way to get that image back. Don't worry about that. There's a few things like that that we'll go through and make a little bit nicer. Well, this looks like the client is using like well, this isn't so really this is just saying that for whatever reason you're walking over. Let me know if you use it. Yes. So you've got the ID of the image, that'll insert the web. Let's head over to your it's this. Is it not even showing it?
Oh, the client secret.
That looks to me like where you're editing your text is probably a different document. So let's go down. Let's think about
Maybe it wasn't.
so
Oh, then I, yes.
now let's go back to your let's try
Let's check. Yeah, well, then you also change the name. We have looking at that. Let's find out. Oh, yeah, that's it. I just want to find out where it is. We go downstairs. Minutes or 8 Yeah, that's right. No, that should. Did you install HTTP server? You did That's really strange. Let's yeah, you might not get a follow this now, but this is yeah. We have to just kind of have you pull up this time around. Yes. Sorry. Yeah. Okay, there's about 2 more steps that I want to go with you through just to kind of help you kind of get on your way to using this in a little more of a fashion. So one thing that we want to do, I'll just go ahead and tell you what the 2 steps are, and then we'll dive into how to do it. One thing that we want to do is, once you are done editing the image and you click done, the image editor should close. It's currently not doing it. Well, we're going to set that up. The other thing that we want to do in this case is once you've edited the image and you click done, it should close the image editor, see that image in the browser in place of the original image. Now, this is all something we can do fairly simply. One of them just involves a little bit more work with the image editor, and the other one's basically just JavaScript stuff. So first things first, let's make sure that that image editor closes when we're done with it the way that we would probably expect it to do. And just so you can see what I'm talking about,
let's say, for example, I go in here and I add this filter to this picture and I hit save. Well, that didn't really do anything, did it? I mean, it seems like it might have done something, but why is the image editor still open? I'm done with it. So we want to get rid of that, and then we want to figure out how to actually use that saved image. So let's first close the image editor. The way that we're going to do that is we can actually set up the way that this works in the configuration object for the image editor. So do you see up here where we have that API key? We added the API key in our configuration object. We're going to add a new property to that object. We're going to call it onSave. This is one of those things that when you read the documentation for the image editor, it would tell you to do this. OnSave is just a hook. So when somebody clicks that button that says save, this whatever is that you put here in the configuration object is going to happen. So it's up to you. You can do whatever you want. But the main idea here is that it needs to be a function. So go ahead and put a function in here. And what we want to do in order to make sure that first the image editor closes is we're going to call this CSDK image editor, simply enough, close. This is half of the story that we've already taken care of it. So if you go back into your image editor now, if your server is still on, go ahead and reload the page. If you edit an image, again, just apply in a filter or something, once you hit save, the image editor should go away. Well, that's cool, I guess. But really, we let the user basically edit the image, and then that edit went away. Not exactly what they were hoping for, probably. So the last step of this that we want to do is, again, we're going to go back to that onSave hook that we have in our configuration object, and we're going to do one more thing. One thing that I didn't tell you in the beginning is that this function, this is basically a callback that's going to take a couple of parameters. It's going to give you two things. It gives you back the image ID and the edited image URL. You could call those parameters whatever you want to, but the point here is that that's what those two things are. It's going to give you the ID back, and it's also going to give you the edited image URL. So I'm going to leave this next line of JavaScript up to you and your partner before I show you what it is. How would we go about using that edited image URL to update the DOM in a way to show that edited image? This is a one-liner. This has nothing to do with this creative SDK at this point. This is just kind of basic JavaScript.
It's basically just a callback function. It takes a couple of parameters. Oh, it's just This brings up a good point. We're going to have to do a little bit of refactoring, not much.
I'm going to type this the way that I would probably think to type this, and it's not going to work. And someone should tell me why it's not going to work. Basically, all we need to do is say that target image.source is the edited image URL. We're basically replacing that source on the image tag with the new URL that URL is coming back from the Adobe servers with that edited image. This is not going to work. Why? Right. Well, it's basically a scope problem, right? So, right, target image is not a global variable. And we might not want a global variable, but we do want a variable in the scope that we're working within. So what we should do instead is refactor. You remember how earlier we defined this variable down here in the click handler? That's out of scope when you're working up here in the configuration object. What we're going to do is come up here and define it instead. So target image. This should work. Basically, target image is going to be undefined until we hit our click handler. Will that work? Let me think. Yep. Another thing you can do instead is define that, put this line up where you initially put the variable, but to keep this a little more dynamic, it's better to do it here. The reason is that you can keep putting edits on top of edits if you want to do that. Okay. So at this point, within your workflow, if you reload the page, what you should be able to do is hit edit. And then, say for example, add a sticker. I'm just going to throw this one on. I'll hit apply, hit save. The image editor closes, and the new image comes back. If your image changes size, that's not a problem. Basically, you're dealing with defaults that you haven't set up. But as a developer, you would have fine control over all of this stuff. Yeah. Yeah, it does, because see how what you're doing here each time is getting that. You can do that too. So that's totally just another option of doing the same thing. So what you're doing instead is and get that. So these two, they are not related. It's just that each time you traverse the DOM, you get that back. And depending on what you want to do, that could be the right way. Just remember that traversing DOM and jQuery is pretty expensive in terms of how you performance. Oh, so there might be situations where you don't want that. But there's nothing wrong with this. You
got use cases for this for social networking apps. We're seeing people use it. Actually creative tools where they want to provide additional build it. So wherever you're like doing something with this, I want to give them an option.
Did you make another change aside from declaring the target image on the top?
That's all I did.
So what's actually happening here? Well, let's let's look up your back over here. Oh, I think this is what the issue. Good work. You may have Oh no, it just took a minute. Yeah, so that was just a web deal. If you're on Windows and you're having an issue with the way that the image is being edited, just let me know. There's an easy fix for that. It's a web deal.
Oh yeah. Yep.
By the way.
So this is so the next question here is a great question. You're getting a new, you know how you're getting that edited image URL back in that on-save handler? That URL is coming from somewhere, right? And if you were going to console log it, you would see that it's coming from AWS. Those are our servers that we're using on AWS. That image is going to be stored for 72 hours because we don't want to host your image. Right? So after that, it's up to you where you want to store it. And so, like in a real web app, if you're going to be working with this image editor, one of the things that you want to make sure you're doing is actually saving the stuff to a location that's permanent in your app, which means maybe you're saving it to your AWS instance or somewhere else. That's up to you. It's also like, how are you going to reference that later? Maybe you're going to use SQL database that tells you where the image is located in AWS and all that good stuff. That part of it is kind of up to how you want to configure it as a developer.
Is there like
Yeah, so our web side of things is completely client side. So there's nothing that Mostly because if we were to offer some kind of solution, that would sort of invariably have to be very opinionated, and developers generally want to be able to finally specify exactly what's happening once they get that image is exact. Right. So
You're talking about whole host of problems.
Right. Exactly. We would be making a lot of assumptions about things that just don't make sense to do. Yeah. Sure.
Got it right. Let's have a little bit here. Go back into the room and go ahead. That should. I got it. So, source of undefined presence, whatever you decide about source on. Target image is that's one of the things. Oh, I see. Is what you've done is you've instantiated this variable twice. So what happens is that this you're not using this variable. You created this variable twice. So you still have to what you want to do is reference this variable. How can you change this? You just want to change this mode. Remember that. So this happened. This is a lot. This is. You should be referencing this. When you add that form, you're doing something. Should work now. Yeah. Just. Okay, cool. So that's how we should make it. Yep. So, now I'm actually going to ask you a question. So, the thing is that you are instantiating the variable. Sorry, you can use twice.
Oh, you didn't get rid of the bar. Oh, sorry.
So what's happening is that it's checking against this because this is the only thing in its scope. You never assigned a value because you made a new variable in this scope.
How much is like a professional like subscription of this?
So you can use, we have a high resolution API, so you have to basically apply it to use. You just gotta follow what you want. That requires writing a server side code. We have basically what we say is if you feel like you're using it, it's not going to shut it down necessarily immediately. Yeah, so that's why we have it in our current service that we evaluate that on a case-by-case basis. So far, we got a lot. Okay, so at this point, with what I wanted to show you how to do. So what we've ended up with is a very sort of like Web 1.0 kind of like web page where we've got plain old buttons and an H1 and all of that. All that other stuff you can figure out like how to do. I want to show you a quick example of something we have on GitHub that's a little bit more of a more advanced version of, ever so slightly more advanced version of what we've done today. If you want to check this out, you're more than welcome to,
by going to creativesdk.github.io. And then what I'm going to do is go all the way down here to where it says live demo of the image editor UI plus HTML drag and drop API. So same sort of story, right? Like just exactly what we've done already, but it's styled, as you can probably guess, with Bootstrap. And so what I can do here is, well, if I wanted to click edit, it'd say, well, you don't have an image. So I can either click here and it's going to give me this, or I can just drag an image straight in. And what that did was, you know how we had that click handler for the edit button? Instead, what you can do is set it up to where it senses the drag and drop with the HTML drag and drop API. So on that event where something has been dropped, that's where we're launching the image editor. And then from here, let's just say, for example, like I'm going to add a quick frame, hit save. That's all great. If I wanted to, I could download that image directly to my device. I could also reset to go back to an older version of the image. All of that I'm handling in JavaScript, and it's not super hard to do. If you want to check that repo out just to see what's going on, it's all jQuery as well, so it's kind of an extension of what we've done today. Head over to creativesdk.github.io. We've got all kinds of cool repos for you to check out. We have a repo demoing how you can use Node and Express to take advantage of our high-resolution API. That one requires a little more setup, and it also requires that you contact us to get access to the high-resolution API, but it is free for you to use. There's no limit on it. Okay, so at this point, we're pretty much done. I wanted to just give you a quick overview of how this image editor gets up and running. Again, a lot of the setup that we did here today in our HTML and JavaScript was really just set up for HTML and JavaScript. Using the SDK, we really only had to write a few lines of code. And what you get is this robust image editor. That's SDKs in general. When you're working with an SDK, basically, it's coming packaged with a bunch of APIs and robust tools that you can use in your code without writing a lot of that code yourself. So any general questions before we wrap up? Pretty much done with what I want. Cool. Yeah. Thank you so much. Hey, thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Do you have any business cards?
Yeah. Here you go. Yeah, appreciate it. Have a good weekend. Hey, thanks for having me, man.
That was like hardcore.
Yeah.
You have that teacher spirit.
I love doing stuff like this. The code, like, love giving talks, but actually getting into the code itself, like, I really dig it. So
You just be like,
Thank you, Ash.